Today, we're tackling a huge question, one that thinkers have been wrestling with for centuries. Why do so many nations, rich in population and tradition, seem to lag when it comes to economic development? We're going to dive into a really provocative answer from Dr. KANBİR's book, which lays out a totally new way to think about progress.
All right, let's just start with a really simple but powerful fact. If you take the 57 countries in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, you're looking at almost a quarter of the entire world's population. That's a huge number of people. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, their combined piece of the global economic pie, it's way, way smaller. Just a little over 8%, actually, based on data from 2018.
So you see this huge disconnect between the number of people and the economic output. And it just begs the question, a question people have been asking forever. What is going on here? What explains this massive gap?
Well, there's a pretty common explanation out there. You hear it from some academics in the West and even from thinkers inside the Islamic world, and it points the finger at the very foundation of these societies.
The argument basically goes something like this. The religion itself is the problem. That supposed traits, like fatalism or a resistance to new ideas, are what's holding these countries back from modernizing and building strong economies. But the book we're exploring today completely pushes back on that idea. It doesn't just disagree, it argues that this claim is a serious, logical mistake, and what's more, it flies in the face of centuries of history.
You see, the book points out that this is a classic logical fallacy. It's called argumentum ad hominem. It's when you attack the people instead of the idea itself. It's kind of like blaming the rulebook for a game that's being played badly, or saying a country's constitution is flawed just because its leaders are corrupt.
And history itself provides this incredible counter-argument. For hundreds of years, the exact opposite was true. The Islamic Golden Age saw mind-blowing progress in science, in medicine, even in finance with early versions of checks. This civilization wasn't lagging behind. For a long time, it was the center of global innovation.
Okay, so if that common explanation is off the mark, what's really going on? To figure that out, the book suggests we need to throw out the old way of looking at this and adopt a completely new framework.
And here is the absolute core argument. The problem isn't the religion of Islam. The problem is the massive, growing gap between the core values the faith teaches and what's actually happening on the ground in many Muslim societies.
So how do you measure a gap like that? Well, the author developed this really groundbreaking tool, the Islamic Development Index, or IGE. It looks at 148 countries and ranks them not on typical Western metrics, but on how well they live up to these core values, like justice and freedom, which are framed as universal human ideals.
Now, what makes this index so different is that it measures two things. First, there's Rafah, which is basically material well-being. Income, health, education, the usual stuff. But then there's Falah, which is all about societal and spiritual health. Things like peace, justice, freedom, and ethics.
And this is the really cool part, how it's built. Take a look at that first principle, Tevhid, which means oneness. The index translates that into individual freedom and responsibility. And what does that look like in a modern society? Entrepreneurship. The same logic connects adalat, or justice, to the rule of law, and hilafet, or stewardship, to good, democratic governance.
All right, so the stage is set. We have this index built on universal values of freedom, justice, and good governance. So what happens when you actually rank countries with it? Well, the results are not what you'd expect at all.
So you have to wonder, right? Which countries actually score the highest on this Islamic Development Index? Who's doing the best job of putting these principles into practice?
And get this, because this is the big reveal of the whole book. The top 10 is filled with countries like Switzerland, New Zealand, and the Scandinavian nations. Not a single Muslim-majority country in sight. It's a bit ironic, isn't it? The countries that best embody these so-called Islamic values are Western secular democracies.
In fact, you have to scroll all the way down the list, past the top 10, past the top 15, and you finally find the first OIC country, the UAE, sitting at number 20. And this isn't just a few outliers either. We're talking about a huge trend here. A whopping 62% of OIC countries don't even make it into the top 100 on this index.
So if you dig a little deeper, you start to see exactly where the biggest problems lie. When you compare them to the world average, the OIC countries fall furthest behind in democracy, in controlling corruption, and in economic freedom. Remember that Falah index, the societal well-being part? This is it right here.
So after all that, what are we supposed to make of this? What's the big takeaway for how we should think about progress and development, not just in the Islamic world, but everywhere?
Well, it all boils down to this one powerful idea. The economic struggles in many of these nations aren't happening because they're too Islamic. They're happening because they aren't Islamic enough, at least not when it comes to applying these core universal principles.
And what this really suggests is that the things we often think of as Western values, good governance, rule of law, justice, fairness, they're not Western at all. They're universal. This index argues they're also right there at the heart of Islamic tradition, and they're the key to prosperity for any society that truly puts them into practice.
And that leaves all of us with a really big question to chew on. For any society, anywhere in the world, maybe the real path to progress isn't about copying someone else's model. Maybe it's about looking inward and rediscovering the most fundamental, universal values that might have been forgotten along the way.